Greetings, friends, fellow Earthlings, and explorers worldwide, and welcome to Ask An Astrobiologist, the show that celebrates the science and the scientists involved in our quest to understand the nature of life. I'm your host, Dr. Graham, the cosmobiologist Lau, and as usual, we're brought to you by the NASA Astrobiology program and SegaNet.org. A huge thanks to all of you out there in the interwebs and digital lands and all the places who are watching our show, who interact with our guests, who interact with me to ask your questions about astrobiology, about NASA's work in missions, trying to look for signs of alien life and more. As always, we love giving a big shout out to those of you who share about our show, who ask questions for our guests on various social media platforms and who reach out to ask questions. This month, we want to highlight someone who goes by the user handle DSL Synth for sharing a fun question that I'll get to later in the show for our guest. And so I'll jump right into it. Today, we're going to be joined by Dr. Penny Boston, a distinguished speleologist and astrobiologist. Speleology, for those who don't know, is the science of caves, cave science, and Dr. Boston certainly has a lot of expertise to share in that realm. She's made significant contributions to our understanding of life in extreme environments, including caves, both on Earth and potentially beyond Earth as well. She founded and directed the Cave and Karst Studies program at New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology and served as the Associate Director of the National Cave and Karst Research Institute, or NCRI. Dr. Boston has many publications underneath of her belt. She's done amazing work in the realm of geomicrobiology and extraterrestrial speleogenesis, or formation of caves. She's been instrumental in advancing our work in looking for signs of life. In 2016, she was became the director of the NASA Astrobiology Institute, where she led interdisciplinary research into the origins and potential existence of life beyond Earth. I checked it out. She has several credits as herself on IMDb for documentaries that she's been part of. She's on the board of advisors for Explore Mars and has given numerous talks and interviews, including for places like the Planetary Society and the Mars Society. And so today we get to ask her all about life, caves, and far more. And so without further ado, welcome to Ask an Astrobiologist, Dr. Penny Boston.
Well, thank you so much, Graham. It's delightful to be able to join you guys.
I'm so excited to have you. I've known of you and of your work for quite some time. I've seen you speak before. It's remarkable, the kinds of ways that you inspire people. I do have a fun question about one of the talks I saw you give some years ago for today. But I want to start off with, as I do with all of our guests, with your science origin story. What was it that drove you as a young person or any point in your career to decide that you wanted to be involved in science, in astrobiology?
Oh, yeah, that was an easy one, really. I mean, I'm a baby boomer, and I was growing up in the early part of the space age, and it was top of mind. And the United States and other countries were, putting a lot of effort into training kids, getting kids interested in what we now call STEM. Didn't call it that then, but science and engineering. And I was fertile ground for that, and I became a science fiction reader very, very early. So, there were a lot of kid science fiction stories written by folks like Robert Heinlein. And so I got hooked really early. And then when I was in probably third or fourth grade, I guess, I saw two articles in these little kid newspapers that we used to have. They were called My Weekly Reader, and they were distributed to classrooms, throughout the U.S. And there was one article by Carl Sagan about exobiology. And there was another little article by Frank Drake about the SETI equation. And I was hooked. It didn't take any more than that. And of course, when I grew up, I got to know Carl. I published a paper with him. I became good friends with Frank Drake and treasured him both as a human being and as a colleague, and for all his amazing work and his delightful family. And, so you don't know what you're going to fall in love with when you're a kid, but boy, I was ready. And that's all it took were, a couple of paragraphs, and I was there. So.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I mean, one, I'm super jealous. I never had the opportunity to meet Carl or Frank. I have met Sasha Sagan and Nadia Drake previously, though. Their children. However, so I also want to share. So, like, a lot of astrobiologists and people I talk to in space exploration, astrobiology, and other realms came to it through science fiction and kind of, like the art of sharing the science and dreaming of what's possible. And so I love that's been part of your original kind of story as well that got you intrigued in the science. Now, I've noted that you referred to yourself as a synthesist, someone who sees a big picture and then puts pieces together. How has that perspective kind of shaped your own approach to astrobiology and to your career?
Well, I'm one of those people with a simultaneous short attention span and long attention span. And, that was not actually very encouraged when I was a kid. It was like, maybe now people would call me ADHD or with a touch of that or something. When I was growing up, it was like, why can't you pay attention and just focus on one thing? And it's like, I can, I mean, and I think it's what was a deficit, really considered a deficit in my early years. Actually, I've parlayed into a strength, which is I love to pluck facts and interesting tidbits, and my mind wants to put all those together. And so, even though I've done a lot of in-depth work, you don't get a PhD without that. I love the big picture. And that's probably what attracted me to astrobiology. That's what attracted me to science fiction was that, if I can look at the galaxy, that makes me happy. And that's true in terms of the broad sweep of science. So, I went through phases where I wanted to be an oceanographer or an astronomer or a chemist or a biologist. And, astrobiology gives you the opportunity to kind of be somewhat all of those things. You don't have to be a specialist in all of those things, but you have to make friends with all your friends who are specialists in those things. And so I love the communal part of it. I love that cottage industry feel. I grew up in a theatrical family, and so somehow astrobiology seems natural to me because it's a
Yeah, I love
stage,
that.
on which we
Yeah.
are trying to reenact the origin of life here and potential origin of life other places, and we have these grand scenes, the exoplanets and so forth. So somehow it seems to have fit my mindset and my early nurturing environment.
I love your analogy of it being a stage. In many ways, like building from bottom up, experimentation, trying to figure out like origins of life, how planets may become habitable or inhabited. There's a lot of ways that we have to envision things that may or may not exist yet. And so it's very much as like this merger of science fiction, and art and understanding. And I love your idea kind of. So often when I speak to students about becoming astrobiologists, I like to tell them to think like a generalist and work like a specialist. And so I love this approach of kind of like synthesizing things together. If you were meeting a bunch of undergraduate students and had to give them advice for how to think in this manner, what would be your key takeaway for them to develop this kind of synthesis approach?
Well, it's not for everybody, Graham. I would say what I say, because I was a professor for a long time and a department chair, and to try to tell people to relax into their actual strengths. Discover what your strengths are, and don't beat the heck out of yourself for your weaknesses. That doesn't mean you don't want to work on your weaknesses. Like if you're crappy at algebra, you probably need to try a little harder. But you don't have to be all things. And this is, one of the great things about astrobiology. It's such a vast realm of intellectual, emotional, and artistic enterprise. You can find a niche and you don't have to try to be somebody else. So I would say, try hard to know yourself and to parlay your strengths. And if your strength is like mine, to be a synthesist, run with that. If you're the kind of person that wants to hang out at the lab bench and drill deeply into the nth degree of a complicated enzyme or a piece of genomic investigation, do that. There's room for all of us, so that's why I love the community feel of it, and also the international community feel of it. I just love that part of it. And so I would tell them to relax. Don't get overwrought. Don't act like you're going into med school and everything is, a giant trial. It's a much friendlier science.
Absolutely. I love astrobiology for the same reasons. It's community. It brings us together from so many backgrounds and disciplines and ideas, and it brings us together to talk about our ideas and share and do research together. And so I love that. Now, I'd be remiss if I just spoke about all the awesome things I think you've done and things like that without getting to caves as fast as possible, because I know people want to hear about it. So let's just jump into caves. And for some of our audience who are watching, maybe they don't like caves so much. I've met people who, I even mentioned this show coming up, they're like, oh my gosh, I hate caves, because they're claustrophobic and they're afraid of enclosed places. And maybe there's an inborn kind of human ideal that, caves are the underworld. They're below our feet. They're openings into the earth. But how do you view caves, for one thing? And what got you into the exploration of caves?
Well, I wasn't a caver. I mean, a lot of friends of mine who turned into cave scientists of one sort or another, cave geologists or archaeologists specializing in caves, they were recreational cavers. I was not. So what drew me to caves was really the science, and publishing on paper in 1992, noodling about Mars really, and where would you go to try to look for the last vestiges of Martian life if it had arisen there? With several colleagues, Chris McKay, of course, being one of them. We've been friends since we were like 17. And we developed the idea of really looking into the subsurface, which was really based on the fact that we were beginning to do drilling into Earth's subsurface and figuring out, all the microbes don't stop at a couple of meters. Because that was the story I got when I was, a student. So we got interested in the subsurface, not necessarily caves, but drilling is complicated. It's very hard to get uncontaminated samples. It costs a whole bunch of money, and in those days we were still, young scientists. We didn't have a lot of resources, and so one of our NASA Ames colleagues, Larry Lemke, who's an aerospace engineer there for many years, and he saw a National Geographic special. And then later, of course, some of my work was, funded by National Geographic, about Lechuga Cave in New Mexico. And, one of the USGS scientists, Kim Cunningham, said in the National Geographic television special that he thought he had seen signs of microbial life in some of the features. And so we said, oh, hey. And I called him up and I said, we're from NASA, because I was NASA funded at the time. And my colleagues were at NASA Ames. And I said, you don't know us, but we're from NASA and we'd like to go into your cave. And so that was really the beginning of the caving and the astrobiology application of the caving. And at the time, in the early 90s, there was so little work on microbiology in caves. It was mostly focused on the macroscopic organisms that are in caves, which are spectacular, and we won't have time to talk about them, but I'm wearing bat earrings, and this is my bat necklace here. Okay, so they're my totem animal. But, that got us into caving, and we didn't know what the heck we were doing. We were so unprepared. It's amazing we didn't kill ourselves, even though we were with, really very solid cavers and stuff. But boy, I was hooked. It was like, nobody's studying this to speak of, and I'm like in a different planet. In fact, I've just come through a cave where it's like I've been in a bunch of different planets. The environment is so different. So, that's what hooked me. And, I was fairly badly injured from the first trip into Lechuga. My ankle swelled up so bad I couldn't get it in the boot, back in the boot. My eye swelled shut from material that fell into my eye, which turned out to be very serendipitous because that material clearly was biological. And, when I got out to the surface, my eye healed up in a few hours. And I'm like, huh, that's not chemistry, because my eye would be, much worse. So, some of these experiential clues, and even though it was really painful and we could have been much more damaged than we were, I realized that I wanted to go back and I wanted to learn how to do this safely. So I did. And, it's taken me all over the world to all different kinds of caves.
Yeah, I love that. So much to unpack here. First off, I love that your body became a biological life detection sensor for finding this dripping material that's a biological thing. That's really cool. If there was something that we really needed to know about like the life that happens inside of caves, what would you say are like the key processes that maybe people who aren't accustomed to like geomicrobiology maybe should know are happening inside of caves right now under our feet?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the coolest things about not just caves, but also the greater rock fracture microbial habitat, of which caves are just kind of big holes in that, is that the biodiversity greatly exceeds the total biodiversity of Earth's surface. And partly that's because it's in a rock environment, it's partitioned in a way that the surface is not. So on Earth, we have weather. We have, things blowing materials around. We have things evaporating with microbes, going up into clouds and then being distributed. We have, great plumes of dust coming across the oceans and being deposited elsewhere. We have animals flying around and walking around and burrowing. And so there's much more churn and gene flow on the surface. But in the subsurface, you have impervious rock layers, you have, porous rock layers, you have faults coming in, you have canyons, you have all these partitions. And each one of these subhabitats has an opportunity to actually go off on its own evolutionary journey. And that's not something I predicted. Before we started doing this, I predicted, wow, it's going to be a very reduced biodiversity because it's really tough to make a living down there. There's not much to eat. And, I was expecting a handful. I was expecting it to be more like a desert. And what it turned out to be is more like a tropical jungle. And that was a big surprise. So making a living, if you need organic material, if you're a heterotroph, it's pretty challenging. You've basically got what limited amount of material is coming in from outside via groundwater or precipitation. And you have potentially ancient organic carbon, that was deposited in the original sediments from which the rock that the cave is delved into or formed into, its origin story. So that focuses us, particularly my interests are in chemolithotrophs, these organisms that don't need organic materials. They just need an energy source that they can mine chemically and in some cases physically, from chemically reduced minerals and metals in the subsurface. So it's a very different kind of food chain than we're used to up here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, a lot of people, they think about primary production, they think about photosynthesis, and these autotrophs who take in carbon dioxide for their carbon source, and they use sunlight. But at the bottoms of the ocean and inside of caves, there's no sunlight, and certainly there's a large connectivity. But it's interesting to think about the kinds of reactions driving life in those environments. Now, you've explored a lot of these different kinds of life, a lot of different kinds of caves. I do want to jump just for a moment to a poll that we shared on the NASA Astrobiology YouTube this past day. We just thought it'd be fun to throw out some different kinds of caves and ask people what they thought was the most important, maybe, for astrobiology. I'm specifically looking, beyond our Earth. And so we gave them options of like a glacier cave, so caves that go under glaciers, crystal caves, like solutional caves, like the Crystal Cave in Mexico, lava tubes, which I find pretty awesome. And then we just for fun, we tossed in talus caves as well, since those are like rock collapses on top of mountains. And we got a lot of votes. The two winners were either lava tubes or glacier caves. And actually, most people voted for glacier caves being the most important for astrobiology. But Penny, for you, what do you think is like maybe the most relevant cave? I mean, obviously there's planetary exploration, but also for alien life and astrobiology. What do you think might be the most important kind of cave to study?
Well, it depends on the context and what your target is. So if you're talking about Mars, it's lava tubes, but it could also be talus. And what we found on Earth is, some of these amazing granite talus caves that we've studied in Portugal and Spain have an entirely unique and rich microbiota. The lava tubes that we've studied all over the world and our colleagues have studied, each one of those has some of the same representatives in terms of metabolic pathways and what they're making a living off, but the identity of the organisms is different. If I were thinking about the outer planet moons, like Enceladus and Europa and Titan, I'd be looking at ice caves. So there's the glacier caves, and there's also ice-filled caves that are made out of other rocks so that, they contain ices. And so they're a different kind of model. So even the limestone caves are relevant. And they're relevant because of the fact that the limestones in many of the caves contain primary minerals that can be the base of the food chain for chemotrophs. So these are bugs that are doing what photosynthesis does in terms of fixing carbon dioxide as biomass. But instead of using sunlight, they're using these chemical transformations. And so the bedrock itself, whether we'll find something like these kinds of sedimentary materials on other planets, really hard to say at this point. We don't really know. We know that Mars, in its current manifestation, is very, very volcanic, but we also know that there are plenty of sedimentary deposits that have been found in, the craters that some of our spacecraft are already, examining. So I think that just about any cave can teach you significant amounts. It doesn't have to be a precise analog. It's really the fact that it's a semi-closed system separated from the surface, and that you're looking at processes that are happening on this small to moderate scale. And that's also a great way to, study ecology. So, I mean, using caves in my teaching, it wasn't just about, caves are cool because they are, but it was also how to look at subsections, of an ecosystem and figure out how it works as a system. So it's a study in system science and applying that to the natural world.
Awesome. So I will say one of my favorite kinds of caves, because there's lots of different kinds of caves and these openings into our Earth. But one that really blew my mind when I learned about it was down in South America. There are these caves with like these big etchings and like scoriations along the walls of the cave, and people have now kind of put together that they're actually the burrows of ancient giant ground sloths from long ago that built these giant things. It makes me wonder, like, are there alien worlds with like giant burrows and like worms kind of feeding these underground caves and stuff like that? It's all so cool to think about, but I've only personally been in a small number of caves, some lava tubes in Hawaii and Iceland, and I've been in some of the big, caves you can visit, like Mammoth Cave and things like that. But you have so much experience in the world. You've been in this great crystal cave in Mexico that many people are just like they've fallen over when they hear that you've been inside of this amazing cave. What is your favorite cave that you've been in so far?
That's almost impossible to answer.
Is it like asking? It's like asking what your favorite child is.
I know. It's like I love all my children. Each one has something fabulous to offer. Of course, the giant crystal caves of Nika are breathtaking visually, and they're extraordinarily interesting because of their origin story. They're sulfuric acid dissolved caves, and that brought up metals in fluids from deep within. And that ore body that rose in that area is the origin of both the caves and the fact that there are mines there, which is why the caves were discovered, because they're commodity metals. So I love it because of its beauty, but I also love it because that origin story and the chemistry that flows from it, I can tie that into Lechuguilla Cave in New Mexico, which is a much more ancient system, but was also created by sulfuric acid. So not all caves are created by sulfuric acid, but the ones that are tend to be extremely huge, and they tend to have very rich microbial contents and unbelievably varied mineralogy, secondary mineralogy that these geochemical and biochemical circumstances are promoting. So my second favorite would be Lechuguilla in New Mexico. My third favorite is Cueva de Villaluz in Tabasco in Mexico. And that is a small cave, and it's a relatively shallow cave, but it's a cave where you can get in and see the sulfuric acid cave forming mechanisms and all the organisms that are adapted to that now, including the fact that bats are flying, bats are in that cave, and they, as delicate as we think of bats and the high metabolism that they have flying, they're able to tolerate high hydrogen sulfide levels that we have to wear masks for. I don't even understand that. I mean, there are fish in there that are practically anaerobic. They get by on the tiniest bit of oxygen, and they're packed with hemoglobin. I mean, the way that even the macroscopic creatures have adapted to that system. So, it's actually a trio of triplets that are all related to some extent for, the chemistry and the geology and the resulting microbiology, even though they're in wildly different places and wildly different, environmental circumstances. And then Fantastic. I love all the other caves too.
Absolutely. You love all your children. I love it. I'm going to leave the audience to keep asking some questions about caves. I see we have some questions coming in the chat from YouTube. For those who are watching live, feel free to keep those questions coming. We'll get them into our queue. I'll do my best to get to as many as I can. But I do have a few more questions myself before we get to our Faster Than Light segment, Penny. First off, your new role with NASA, you're now involved in a more of a coaching role for coaching early and mid-career scientists. I wonder, firstly, can you explain what this role is and how you see yourself at NASA now?
Yes, I love it. I really enjoyed heading up the NASA Astrobiology Institute during its last 3.5 years. It had a 20-year mandate, and so I was its last director. I loved that. But even more, I love what I'm doing now, which is, it's called a portfolio scientist. And it fits me because I am trained in biology, geology, atmospheric chemistry, astronomy, and it get back to the synthesist aspect. And so I'm doing a lot of coaching of our early career folks, which gives me a lot of the things I loved about being a professor without some of the things that I didn't love about being a professor. And it also keeps me, right up against helping folks, develop their concepts for missions, for research campaigns. And I get to do it in this broad sweep of sciences, so including earth science. And I have a long history in earth science too. I did my dissertation on microbial atmospheric interactions on Earth and so forth. So I love taking these brilliant young people that we're attracting at NASA and in fact elsewhere, and helping them figure out how to shape their ideas to make them competitive. Competing for missions and funding and all that, it's not easy. It's probably the most challenging thing about being a scientist at NASA is, how do you get your ideas out there and get enough attention so that you can actually, manifest them and push forward and participate in missions. So I just adore that. So, I'm one of the managers of the NASA postdoc program, for example, at Ames. And I just love that. And
Yeah.
one of the other things that I'm really devoted to is that I'm the senior executive sponsor for the Ames Disabilities Associates. So I'm very concerned and try to help where I can with accommodating folks with different kinds of physical and neurological disabilities or atypical neurodiverse folks because there's so much talent there. Even one of my friends at NASA is, born without legs and with limited arms, and she's been on a vomit comet ride and stuff. So it's amazing, and that's all part of the same sequence of, being fascinated by the whole experience of being human or being any other kind of animal.
Wow. Penny, I love that so much. I didn't know you were doing that work. That's incredible. There's so much variety of human experience, not just in how we think and our backgrounds and where we come from, but also our abilities, our physical embodiment in the world. And everything is changing right now. There's new opportunities for us to engage with our embodiment in different ways. We also have people who are willing to understand that some of us think differently. Some of us have a different way of approaching problems.
Yes, because brains are so amazing, and we have so many different kinds of them. And this is why, from my personal experience, being told that I should do stuff a way that I couldn't do it when I was a kid, I feel for people who are neurodivergent because they have so much to give, and things are much, much better now. So, it's not 1960 anymore, but it's still something that the average person who doesn't have, some kind of divergent capabilities, doesn't relate to if they are not friends or family with folks with those conditions. So getting the word out and normalizing this, and then being able to tap into that, spectacular wealth of talent that we have for us. NASA needs every brain cell it can get,
Absolutely. So that actually is an interesting transition. I wanted to mention, so a few years ago now, I think it was maybe 2018 or so, I was part of this science and art festival in California called MAX. You were also a speaker along with Julia De Marinas, and many of our friends in astrobiology were presenting and part of a bunch of the events going on. And you gave a talk that really just hit me close to home. And I loved it so much because it made me think a lot about people I've known in my life and how much things can change. And you spoke about how, for instance, like caving equipment when you first started was more focused on men, and there wasn't so much equipment for women. And then spacesuits have been so focused on not just men, one kind of body type of man. And so like we recently had that NASA spacewalk that was supposed to happen with two women, and it couldn't happen because they didn't have spacesuits that fit both women to do the spacewalk. And so I'd love to hear your perspective of how things are changing to ensure, that we have an inclusivity in the field of astrobiology and space exploration, because you gave such a wonderful and passionate talk about ensuring that women, had the right equipment.
Yeah, and it applies to everybody. And one of the things that I think is fundamental is no matter how wonderful an engineer, architect, designer you are, you have to go into the environment you're designing to. You have to experience it. And this is something that, I try to make this point to mission planners. It's like, if you have never been in a rugged environment on Earth as an analog for what you're designing missions to, you are not experiencing it the way you need to. So, that's the same with gear. And it's like, how do you get into the head of another person? Very hard. And the only way I know how to do it is to go with them somewhere and do something that they do. So, I've dragged, MIT, engineers out into lava tubes. And it was maybe not so easy for them. They were pretty much out of their comfort zone. But I felt that it was necessary. I've done, 2 different Mars habitat simulations with the Mars Society years ago. And even though, I'm a smarty pants and have done, field work for a zillion years, and even though I thought it through tremendously, even the fake, spacesuits we were wearing, it was even harder than I thought it was going to be. And I ran into issues that I had not anticipated. Even though I grew up as a dancer, I'm pretty three-dimensionally aware. But when you're in a spacesuit, it's just really hard. So experience is really what it boils down to. You have to walk, talk, crawl, think, roll, swim in somebody else's experience in order to really be able to, advance how we help people explore and understand the world.
Absolutely. I love that. Like embodying how others might embody themselves and trying to think about that is so crucial. I do want to, so before we go to our Fast and Light segment, you just mentioned, you grew up dancing. You kind of briefly mentioned before some parental influence in the arts. I'd love to hear more about how art has influenced you in your life from your parents, and how they influenced you and then your own work, as a young person dancing in your own work. I understand that you've also written poetry and created artwork. I'd love to hear about art and how it's influenced your life and how it empowers your life.
Oh yeah, well it's everything to me. I mean, to me, science and art are inextricably bound. So, I grew up in a theatrical family, and my mother was a ballerina. She later became, a dance instructor. She started off in vaudeville as a little kid, um, you know, dancing on roller skates and in acrobatics and all that stuff. My father had an operatic voice, and he started off in. He, was a scion of a prosperous Quaker family in Ireland, and and hated all that stuff. And he went into the theater, and he became an actor. And he also had a fabulous voice. So he did a lot of operettas. He was on the BBC a great deal. Before they left after World War II, it was pretty awful in Europe at the time. And they went to Australia, then New Zealand, then finally came to the United States, where I was born. And so I have that deeply saturated in me. And I'm a very visual person, very visual thinker, and textural thinker. And so my art and my science has always got that visual element, even if it's calculational, So to me, they're meshed. And so, most of my poetry is about, well, most of it is somehow inspired by science. It's not all 100% science, but, observations. It's a different way of distilling what we write in our science prose. It's a different way of plucking out some of that experiential value that I get from the science and that I try to give back to the science. And then a lot of my artwork is it's for fun. Some of it's quirky, some of it's jokes. Very often it'll be an astrobiology scenario that I've been thinking about that I try to illustrate. Um, one of my favorites that I've done is called Walking the Herd, and it's this little bizarre being that's shuffling along a lot of tiny microbes, and it doesn't map onto a typical terrestrial animal, and yet it's clearly a being, an intelligent being. So, I use it as a thinking tool and for my own amusement.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah. This act of creation, for some of us, it's a release, it's fun, it's an imperative, it saves us from depression. It lets us understand each other, like an expression of our understanding of the universe. And so I love that so much. I'm going to ask you now to play a little linguistically with me as we go into our Faster Than Light segment. I have some questions I ask of everyone who comes on the show. They're kind of just a fun way for us to gauge the range of astrobiological thinking. The first question. Absolutely. My first question, what is your favorite thing that life on Earth does?
Oh, God, it's so hard. Um, I think the overall umbrella is that life as a process continues to invent new things from information bits that it already has. So every now and again, you get a new bit of information, but a great deal of the innovation as creatures adapt to their environment is this reshuffling of, pieces of information. Steve Wolfram's new kind of math thinking, where things are built up from, modular, smaller processes. I think that's a fundamental insight that he and his colleagues had. And I really see that in biology, this ability to take stuff and just throw those pickup sticks up into the air and create a new thing to meet new circumstances. Just endlessly fascinating to me.
Absolutely. There's so much we're learning about technology and intelligence amongst other creatures, which leads me to my next question. If you could communicate with any non-human intelligent organism on the Earth, what would it be and what would you want to talk about?
This is so easy. It's octopuses. I would want to talk about anything the octopus wanted to talk about. I think they're amazing, and I'm endlessly fascinated by how different their intelligence is distributed. The structure of their brains and where it is in their body plan, and the fact that each one of their tentacles is, capable of a certain degree of thought by itself, and how that must be to integrate all that into a unified consciousness. I mean, if I could be an octopus, I would be an octopus to answer those questions. And the way they communicate, I just am raptured by them. I almost went into octopus biology. But in the time, when I was in college, basically that meant hacking things up, and I don't do that.
Yeah. So some of my favorite experiences, night diving, when you go scuba diving, or when you see octopuses and their color changing at night underwater. It's so cool.
Yes, me too. Because I grew up partly in Florida, and so diving and all of that was a miraculous world. But yeah, I love them. I love them so much.
Absolutely. Such cool creatures. You mentioned earlier that science fiction inspired you when you were younger. You mentioned Robert Heinlein. And so we're curious, what stories have inspired you to want to know more about life beyond Earth?
Oh, so many. So many. I mean, one that really struck me when I was quite young was Childhood's End by Arthur Clarke. And, that was a wonderful mix of intelligent creatures from elsewhere coming to Earth to, help humanity. And I don't want to give any spoilers here, but there's really a different different motivation and processes that are much larger than that the humans don't understand until very late in the story. That made a huge impact on me. I read a lot of Heinlein, of course, a lot of the classic older authors, but I'm reading the latest new folks too. So, we have a NASA Ames science fiction club that one of my colleagues, Kathy Lee, and I started, and I love that because we just talk about new writers coming along and in different languages, and Afrofuturism is a whole new thing to me, and so science fiction is still going strong, and I dip my toes in whenever I can.
Absolutely. I mean, I love sci-fi. I find it hard to even keep up. There's just so many incredible authors, and there's so much cool work. It's just so incredible, which excites me about the future. And so that's a fun question. And this can be in any realm: science fiction, art, whatever you're feeling. What is something that excites you about the future?
I'm hopeful that in spite of the silly hype right at the moment, that artificial intelligence will enable us to extend our direct personal intelligence directly. I don't want to just give problems to an AI tool and have it tell me stuff. I want to be able to increase my own personal capability to integrate things. And I think we may be going into that direction. There's still a lot of hurdles in the way. And it's a little distressing hearing, the kind of, I don't know what to call it, sort of corrupted version of AI that we're now seeing in the public media, but I think that's a transient phase, and that the ability to synthesize things beyond just what our single human brain or even group of people's brains can do is really the future.
Yeah, absolutely. So much is changing in the realm of AI. I was just at a really incredible meeting where we were discussing intelligence and consciousness and alien life, but there was also a big focus on where AI is going. We talked a lot about AGI and some of those ideas, and a lot of folks are thinking of like the augmentation of our lives and our bodies through AI in the near future as well.
I'm not
It's
icked by
possible.
that. I know some people are icked out by that, but 20 years ago, I gave a talk at a robotics conference about the role of cybernetic enhancement as just another level of evolution, and I really believe that, and even more so now than when I first wrote that talk, 20 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're already using medical science to augment ourselves in many ways. We're doing a lot to change. And so obviously it seems like, sensible that the technology would allow us to augment ourselves further in the future. And so I know that maybe people watching right now who don't like this idea, but there's a lot of great conversations to have here in realms of optimism and pessimism and everything in between about where AI is taking us. We are running slowly out of time for our faster than light segment, so I'm going to jump to my last question, and it's the most fun one of all. What is an unbelievable science fact that still blows your mind?
Well, so I mean, there's an intro to that, which is what's unbelievable to me is that I get to live in an era where all the sciences are exploding at once. And I'm bombarded on a daily basis by that, and I revel in it. But underlying all of that is really the unfathomable size and depth of time of the universe. I remember when it first hit my brain that was the case when I was probably about 6, looking up at the stars, and now I'm old and I still have the same emotional response to that. And I wrestle with it all the time. A lot of my poetry has to do with, trying to grasp space and time as a tiny, tiny, minuscule mote within the universe. Personally,
I love that. Yeah, our minds did not evolve to process things in the millions and billions and trillions, no matter what the scale, super small to super large, super short to super long. Like, we evolved to see things as they are right in front of us, so that we could hunt and eat and survive and reproduce and all of these things. And so, yeah, there's so much that we're lacking, I think, in our understanding. And so, yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's not, that tiger's lineage of existence is, several billions of years that I'm connected to through Earth and time. It's kind of it's amazing science has gotten us here.
It is.
It's very cool to see science evolving itself.
That is, a bunch of quarrelsome, nasty little monkeys that we've actually learned to understand anything. So I'm kind of proud of us, even though I know all of our flaws.
Yeah, and we'll certainly make more mistakes along the way, but we also have a lot of potential. So I'm going to jump to our audience Q&A here with the last 10 minutes we have or so left. We have 2 pre-show questions, and I see several have rolled in already from our guests who are watching in the chat right now. We're going to start off with a question from Dr. Jim Past. Dr. Past is an astrosociologist who often likes to ask social-related questions to astrobiology. And so he's asking, yeah, he's great. He asks, what social scientific precautions are necessary when working together with your teams to remain safe while conducting scientific investigations in caves? And how are lessons learned on Earth relevant to those on Mars in the future?
I think, Jim and I have actually, talked about this over time, although we haven't talked recently. And my view is that you have to grow a team into some version of a family unit. I mentioned before the cottage industry model of astrobiology. To me, that is the way that humans function. We can have all the checklists that we want, and we can have all the, linear military style line of command and all that. Those are overlays. They're additional tools. But if you don't have a deeply bonded group of people that can think together and work together for a common good, no amount of overlay of additional discipline and tools will make the difference. And so, for cave teams, we have an expedition leader, which I try to make never me, because I'm paying attention to the science. And the primary relationship is the safety of the team is paramount. No amount of tempting exploration where you want to leave the group and go beyond the next hill without telling somebody or taking somebody. I mean, it's basically Brownie and Boy Scout and Girl Scout behavior, because that's what humans do. And so, we have to acknowledge our humanness in order to make those safe teams.
Yeah, I love that so much. Our next question comes from this month's ambassador at DSL Synth, since they asked a question. So your team and yourself, you've explored this Cueva de los Cristales in Nica, Mexico. They just want to know, what was the experience like being in a cave with giant crystals like that? They also want to know if any new crystals have been discovered or if anything's going on since this cave was kind of sealed off. I guess their basic question is, what's happening with the research?
What's happening? Well, it's owned by a mining company. So it's an active mining site. And so the science is way less than secondary. And so access to it, is at the behest of the mining company. So we were very fortunate to be able to get in. It is not, to my knowledge, accessible at this point. But the answer to, are more things being discovered? Yes. In the second National Geographic exploration expedition that we did, and this, which was also reflected in the second National Geographic, television special, there is a whole other, even deeper layer of caves that is very remarkable and very different. Bizarre formations that don't look at all like, the giant crystals. The personal experience was extreme discomfort. We were in pseudo spacesuits light, packed in ice. Our torsos were packed in vests with ice inserts, and an ice pack on our heads underneath our caving helmets, and a breathing unit on our backs that was running air, just ordinary air from the cave, but running it over cooled surfaces, ice surfaces. And even so, it was hard to take. And the experience is sending a brain message to your muscles, and they cannot respond. And then sort of going down the rabbit hole of consciousness where you really need to pay attention to the people who are telling you to come out, because you are no longer capable of really telling where you are in your survivability. Yeah, it was a great learning experience.
Yeah. Talk about an extreme environment for life as we know it, for human life. Things that have grown into, Yeah, exactly. So, and that leads to our next question. User at Freshy51 on YouTube wants to know if maybe this kind of life that does love that kind of environment, these high temperature underground lithoautotrophs, maybe surviving off of decay products from radiation or other processes in the subsurface of our crust, if you think that they're a good example of what might be the most common other life in the solar system, if there is other life in the solar system.
I think so. And part of the reason I think so is because gradually the genomics that is being uncovered about subsurface organisms is showing this massive diversity, but also, deeply converged lines that show great antiquity of a lot of these organisms. And my own personal opinion, which I think is going to be very hard to demonstrate easily, but over time, perhaps, is that there's an indigenous native microflora that lives in the rock. It lives in rock fractures. It gets dragged around with the supercontinental cycles of 1 billion years on Earth. The bugs are there in the rocks. The rocks get dragged around. Some of them get subducted, but a lot of them just get shoved around. And I think they have permanent inhabitants. And that when you have a cave that develops in those rocks, then those organisms that have survived are the seed stock. So, that is something that potentially would apply to maybe Mars, could apply even to lifelike processes on Titan, perhaps in, the subsurface liquid interiors of the icy moons, Enceladus and Europa. So I think it's not just that we're looking for an exact analog. We're not looking for a place on Earth that's exactly like some other planet, but because it's so different from our average view of life on Earth, it's teaching us all different, parts. It's like putting Legos together or a jigsaw puzzle where you only have a few of the pieces and you're still struggling to find more.
Yeah. One of our users, Trayton Garcia on YouTube, wants to know if you're thinking about like subterranean systems expand this idea of the Goldilocks zone beyond a star's energy. We some people think that you have to be in this Goldilocks zone to have liquid water to planet's surface, and these subterranean systems kind of they force us to think outside of that, right?
Yes, I mean we're already been forced to think out of that classical, early 1970s idea of the habitable zone, which is sort of got going in the 60s and then was refined a bit in the 70s. It was a brilliant insight. And now we know that we have to expand that potentially to icy moons around, gas giants in solar systems. And I also think I call these type 2 biospheres. So I call Earth a type 1 biosphere, where it's obvious and it has, large surface manifestation and it's photosynthetically driven, at least in part. A type 2 would be what we would expect on Mars, what we would expect in the icy moons. That is, it's cryptic from the surface. You can't see that it's there. So, it's a lovely notion. How do we test that in, an exoplanetary system? I don't know. Are there subtle signs that says somebody's here hiding below? I don't know. As we learn more about our subsurface here on Earth, that will help enrich our knowledge and maybe prepare us, to tackle that much greater question in the future.
Agreed. I'm going to ask one more question here. We're almost at the very top of the hour. User Juliana Murer on YouTube. I'm going to expand from just caves to think about all kinds of holes and entries and porosity inside of rock. Do you think it's possible for life to arise inside of these kinds of rock openings and crustal regions? Or are they just like a habitat for life and maybe life has to start in an ocean or around a hot spring? Do you think life could start inside of cracks or caves?
I think it potentially could. There's, energy available. There is fluid with different, chemical components. So I think that the subsurface shares that with many of the surface environments that have been pointed to as possible origins of life sites. My own view of Earth's, origin of life is that when you have a planet with untold quadrillions of chemical experiments going on simultaneously for millions of years, you're probably giving life-like processes a chance to arise in multiple different sites. I think of a unified life chemistry that we have is derivative, from initial many different sites at which life was arising. And so I think that you have a lot of the basic ingredients in the subsurface to make that also a place where life could potentially begin.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Penny Boston, thank you so much for your time, for joining us. I'm so glad we finally had you on the show. I'm sure our audience who are watching right now live and later after the fact in time and space also appreciate your time sharing with us here today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. I love what
Awesome.
you guys are doing on Ask an Astrobiologist. I love it.
Oh, Thank you so much. We really appreciate that. For all of those who are watching now and in the future, you can always join our mailing list for the NASA Astrobiology program. It's a great way to learn about not only upcoming episodes of our show, but other video that NASA Astrobiology is working on, other events, conferences, meetings, opportunities, articles, the whole gamut of all of the awesome things coming from NASA Astrobiology. You can find it out there. Of course, if you're watching this on YouTube, you can always hit the like and subscribe buttons on the NASA Astrobiology YouTube channel. It's a great way to follow along with all the cool upcoming live events and things that we have. To Penny for joining us, thank you so much. To our entire audience, thank you so much. Thanks for joining. And until next time, as always, stay curious.